Hello and welcome back after that long break. My name is Scott Appleby. I am a professor of history and the dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and we have a very important panel discussion now that focuses on policy impact when we think about looking at religious freedom through the lens of integral human development through the lens of religious freedom. How do we think about policy impact of this conversation? Where do we go in that direction? I'll preface this just by saying when we say the word policy, we can mean an awful lot of things. I guess the immediate connotation is government policy, various agencies within any particular government. There are also policies, of course, that govern NGOs, that govern churches, the private sector, corporations. So policy is a kind of a broad term that can be interpreted in various ways. Also, we might include in the conversation the question of practices that are closely related to policies but are distinct from specific policies. And finally, we might ask, how do we make policies, hard or soft, about matters of the soul, so to speak, about matters of human integrity, human development, the spiritual as well as the political, those elements of life that are not easily quantified or reduced to social, scientific, political, economic categories. What does policy mean in the context, and what are the limits of policy as well as what it can illuminate and how it can help advance this conversation? So we have a very distinguished panel, and we'll go one at a time. I'll give very brief introductions to our panelists who will speak for 7 to 8 minutes, and then I'll be flagging their 1 minute mark at some point, and come at this from various perspectives, beginning with Rajeev Bhargava, who's the director of the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in India. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I want to focus on I thought I'd focus on two of the issues that were raised in the note that was given to me, but given the time, I'll have exclusive focus on one, and that is why is there suspicion in our parts of the world around the advocacy of religious freedom? I mean, why is it seen as a partisan political tool to further some hidden agenda? And this agenda can be seen in two ways. One is a larger, imperial economic and political agenda, but the other is a more specific agenda of particular religions. And I think my focus will be on the latter. Now, let me begin, first of all, by saying that we are living in India in very troubled times. There is lots of religious intolerance. There is a huge amount of religious discrimination. I think one of the speakers mentioned that there is a 19% decline in religious freedom. And I think in India, probably more in the last 10, 15 years. There is, I can remember churches being vandalized, many churches being burned, some missionaries being burnt alive horrifically. And not only have there been social disruptions of religious activities of the minorities, but there have been some political restrictions that have been placed, and a lot of political agendas have been set around the favoritism which has been given to religious minorities. Muslims have been the prime target, but Christians too. So, and nothing can justify this kind of religious persecution and religious violence. It can neither on religious grounds, nor on grounds of constitutional democracy, nor on humanitarian grounds. So everybody should be concerned. about it, and there are no words strong enough to condemn something like that. However, given all that, I mean, I think somebody in the morning mentioned that there is a great deal of suspicion of Christian activities. I think there was a figure mentioned, I can't remember in what context, 365 million Christian, what it was, I forget. But most of the secular-minded people, they are very upset about it, but ordinary Hindus appear not to be too concerned with even religious violence against minorities. And I think it's taking that into account, that I'm raising this question. Is there any reason for being suspicious? And if there is some suspicion, then what is the reason for the suspicion? Now, Indian Constitution gives the right to religious freedom, and religious freedom includes not only the religious belief, the freedom of religious belief and practice, but also the right to preach and to propagate. I think that's where some of the problems really begin. The right to propagate is seen by a lot of people as freedom to convert. And that is where the problems really begin. Now, freedom to convert can be understood in two different ways. It's the freedom of the converter and the freedom of the convertee. Of course, there is always the freedom of the convertee to move from one religion to another. That is individual freedom, right? But it's often seen also as, because it's the freedom of propagation and preaching, it's taken to mean freedom of the converter. And often there's a lot of ambiguity about it, and that is where all the problems really arise. I mean, if conversion is a result of a long process of transformation from one way of worshipping or teaching, matters relating to God or some other supernatural being, to another way of being, then it wouldn't be, this would be not a problem, because this is a two-way process. It's a negotiation that takes place between two individuals and two groups over a long period of time. But that is not how it's seen by a large number of people in India, certainly not by Hindus. They see it as a one-way process. A lot of people believe that it's not the literate upper classes, upper middle classes who are open to conversion. It's the poor, the Dalits, and the Adivasis, namely the indigenous people, who are swayed by missionary activity. And some people even argue that the right to preach and propagate is a right which was given to Indian citizens. But if that is the case, then why give this right to foreign missionaries, people who come from outside India and propagate and preach and eventually convert Adivasis, Dalits, people who are classified as Hindus into. And this is a problem not in most of the Christians living in India, but certainly, as I said, new evangelists, new Pentecostalists, their kind of activity is treated with a lot of suspicion. And this is terrible even for Hindu-Christian relations, because those Christians who've been living in India for many, many years and who were indigenous to India, but who converted to Christianity at some, 1,000 years ago or more, these are people who feel quite threatened by this new missionary activity, because they feel estranged from their neighbors, from Hindu neighbors and so on. So this is a big problem. Now, is this just an imaginary thing, or is there some real truth in it? And that is the question that I want to raise here in the remaining, 3 minutes that I have. So I think I go back to one of my heroes in comparative religion. I'm not an expert on religion, I'm a political philosopher, but nonetheless, I have a hero, and he's long dead, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And I was reading one of his books where he quotes Canon Warren, and he said, this was in the 60s, he said, the impact of agnostic science will turn out to be child's play compared to the challenge to Christian theology of the faith of other men and women, of course. In other words, it will be very difficult. That's what he said in the 60s. It'll be very difficult for Christian missionaries to face up to the challenge of deep religious diversity. He felt that the missionary enterprise is in a fundamental and profound crisis in places such as India. And he also felt, and I'm quoting him here, it is from the mission field that the scandal of a fundamental fallacy in traditional Christian theology has emerged. Quote, this is a quotation from him. So I think the impression that I got from reading him is that in traditional theology, Christian theology, religious pluralism is very hard to accommodate. And there is a certain arrogance which is mixed up with imperial arrogance. In an arrogance to claim that there is one true God and all other gods are false, that you shall not worship all other gods, and that those who worship other gods must either come into your fold, or if they don't come into your fold, they should be treated as enemies to be fought, and if necessary, even to be eliminated. And we know that something like this did happen in all the European wars of religion, and that's been one of the major causes of a lot of tension. So if the other is seen as a radical other, as somebody who's an existential threat, then it's hard to live with that person. And I think if that is something which is part of traditional Christian theology, then one can trace the roots of suspicion that people who have no missionary activity in their religions, people like Jews or Hindus who are born as Hindus or Jews, but who do not seek to convert others, they will see this kind of missionary activity as a threat. So I think it's not very clear to me. I believe that after the Second Vatican Council, there is a growth of religious pluralism even among Christians. I think Cantwell Smith, writing in the 60s, could say what he said. But if the religious field among some Christians, maybe the new Christians or perhaps very traditional Christians, if their theology hasn't changed, if that theological, what did he say, a fundamental fallacy in traditional Christianity hasn't changed, then I think we will find it'll find itself difficult to it'll be difficult to sustain itself in countries such as India, and this problem will fester. It doesn't justify, as I said, any of this violence and that is going on, and upon which you have all kinds of political agendas being built. But if we really, went to the question that was addressed in the note, I think we may just have to tackle it. I'll stop there.
Very good, thank you. Thanks for raising a topic that's been overlooked so far that's very essential, and that's the question of mission work, conversion, proselytism, and how it falls within this notion of the right to religious freedom. Does that include the right to share one's faith, to proselytize, and the right not to be bothered, the right not to be proselytized? And the only other thing to mention at this point is that we see, even when we talk about the diversity and the plural nature, the way in which certain religions like Hinduism has itself evolved from a religion that did not have a strong missionary under Hindutva and this increasing nationalism, which is largely an imitation of Western patterns. Suddenly it becomes, over the last decades with the VHP and the whole troika of movements, it becomes a very real and disturbing practice for many. So Christians, Muslims, Hindus, it becomes a more generalizable challenge within the regime of religious freedom. So
They're now rivals. These are like world
competing
with each other.
Competing.
And these guys have also, both they stigmatize and emulate at the same time.
Yes.
But probably, I wouldn't say the worst of the others, but certainly one section of other.
I used to call this an awkward mimesis of Christian missionaries. It's become less awkward as they've gotten more refined in it. But let's go on. You may have noticed that the next speaker is not indeed Fiona Bruce, but David Burrows. Fiona Bruce, politics has a way of intervening in regular life, and she was at the last minute called to stay home, I think, in the UK. And so we're pleased that David Burrows, who works with Fiona Bruce as the Deputy Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion and Belief in the UK, is here with us now. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our wonderful hosts, the Order of Malta, and all the partners and organisers of Fabio. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, sadly, Fiona couldn't be here, and we're talking about the subject of being left behind and no one being left behind in terms of the achievement of the SDGs, of which is a passionate concern to Fiona, but sadly she's been left behind in the UK. In that context of being left behind, also my luggage was left behind in London, so my apologies for being without a jacket, amongst other things, today. So look, the role of freedom of religion or belief and sustainable development is an area close to our heart. Mariz will talk about this as well, just how much we are concerned about the impact on the issue of poverty across the world when there is also discrimination on grounds of religion or belief. And that area it matters greatly. It matters greatly to some of the most vulnerable communities and individuals across the world, and is, I believe, still, sadly, despite some lights, some chinks we heard from the USAID colleagues and others, there is nevertheless, it is very much under-recognised, not least by many policymakers, not least by those not working in FORB and Freedom of Religion or Belief, Article 4 is, and it's important that we don't just talk to ourselves, that very much it is an issue which is embraced. And this is why this conference is so important, about how we use the right language, how we use the right principles in order to do that. And that's why we, and I say we in terms of the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, has sought to very much gather people, NGOs, civil society, countries together to support the cause of FORB, but to see FORB very much as a crucial part of the mainstream concerns, the issues of human dignity, of tackling poverty, of supporting sustainable development. Given, as we all know, that FORB is a fundamental, universal human right, it should almost go without saying that it's applicable and relevant to everyone's freedom, and yes, everyone's free human flourishing, as we've heard earlier in this conference, for the integral human development of everyone, everywhere. But FORB and human rights, as has already been discussed, is not a universal language, and that's why, not least, the framing of integral human development, or that acronym, as you say, the IHD, which is now in the parlance as well, is so welcome, and not least welcome in terms of policy and policy impact. We've got no time to lose, obviously, when we look at the issue of the marginalisation of religious communities, the impact on poverty on them, and how sadly too many religious communities and individuals are excluded from being not only recognised as an essential part of the problem, but also, crucially, as being part of the solution. And that's important, international, national, and local, as we've heard earlier in this conference. So great steps need to be taken. There have been some good steps, some chinks, some lights, and not least in the UK, the important step in securing language in the UK government's International Development White Paper, published last autumn. Crucially, you may say with elections now on a very much a cross-party basis, it will be a policy that lasts in many ways, specifically recognizing that religious minorities are among those most at risk from being left behind, and that protecting and prioritizing those most in need must be at the heart of humanitarian efforts. So the challenge now for us all is how to translate that into action, and Mariz, hopefully we'll hear more from her on that. But looking at the issue of how do we make a difference in terms of policy terms, Fiona Bruce's focus, and myself supporting her, has very much been as UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy for FORB to support the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance. She was chair for 2 years until December, now the vice chair, and very much passing the baton on to the current chair, Robert Rajeev, who we'll be hearing from in the later panel. In many ways, I'm here as the sort of antipasto to Robert's il secondo, so we'll see how I do, and whet your appetite for later. But just to tell you a little bit about URFBA, because it's important, because it is, I think, a good model of policy making, collaborative. It's a grouping of now some 43 countries committed to that fundamental right of FORB. And in the note to us all, you've been looking at the issue of where is that cross-government collaboration, and one area is in the area of the alliance. It is the fact that it's only 4 years old, and it's been the first times that there's been this level of envoys, senior officials, indeed civil society together, month by month, focusing on FORB and seeking, yes, Article 18 may well now no longer be what was called some years ago an orphan right, although in the UK, I'd probably say gently to Richard that I don't think FORB I think indeed is far from a golden child. But nevertheless, the existence of URFBA that's led to 16 specifically FORB and special envoys. You know, there was just the one US ambassador at large. Now, obviously, envoys, Fiona would say it herself, Robert, they're not the answer in themselves, but they certainly play a valuable role in ensuring that governments continue that focus on FORB and FORB as it impacts in the wider policy area. And that's important. So, and in terms of the members, and we're looking at, are we a club? How much are we reaching out across the world? It covers, in every region of the world, in terms of members of URFBA, from Europe and North America, from Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. Obviously, we'd love more countries to join, but in order to do so, there must be that commitment to Article 18, both domestically and internationally. That shorthand name that we have, Article 18 Alliance, is, as we say in the UK, it does exactly what it says on the tin, and not everyone's going to feel able to sign up to that. But we're looking at how we can support those countries that are on that journey that won't be able to easily sign up. Those that also, as we've spoken here, that don't easily speak that are in the same language and framing of how we can encourage and support, and we want to work without diluting the effectiveness of URFBA and Article 18. Nevertheless, we want to have an open hand of friendship and see how we can work together. In terms of practical action, which is the subject of this panel, one particular focus of the Alliance has always been and will always be about championing the cause of those who are imprisoned on account of their religion or belief. It's a visible, we're talking about practical examples, sadly, it's a very visible, cruel demonstration of states seeking to remove individuals' dignity. So we advocate through statements from the chair, advocacy in lots of forms privately and sometimes in social media, encouraging diplomatic engagement and in appropriate cases, public engagement. So that means, in terms of the breadth of that, which is relevant, it means supporting Ahmadis, Sufi, Uyghur Muslims, Protestant, Catholic and evangelical Christians, Jews, Baha'is, Buddhists, Jehovah's Witnesses and humanists. And that's very relevant and important to show the breadth of the universal right and how that engages so broadly, deeply. It means that in the last year, there's been a measure of success. One can't measure the success wholly, but there's been 3 that have been released. Hannah Abdimalik from Somaliland, Shamil Kakimov from Tajikistan, and indeed Bishop Alvarez, who will be well known to many here, from Nicaragua. Indeed, the UK government and others welcomed the release of Bishop Alvarez alongside 18 other clergy from that unjust detention in Nicaragua, but sadly whilst condemning still their expulsion from their home country. But also the president of the Humanist Association in Nigeria, Mubarak Bala, his 24-year sentence has been reduced to 5 years, just showing the importance of the religion belief spectrum. We'll be hearing from my French colleague about that shortly, I'm sure. But we operate humbly and collectively, knowing that we are in a shared enterprise of advocacy to seek to have some effect. We issue statements on behalf of a wide range of issues, ranging from Ukraine to Nigeria, Nicaragua, some with very specific challenges, not least individual faith groups covering Christians, Jews, Baha'is, Jehovah's Witnesses, Ahmadi Muslims, and the non-religious. It's that, I suppose, collaboration, that co-belligerency, that recognizing both in what we say and what we do, that freedom of religion and belief is for all and everywhere and must be acted upon. And that's, where does it matter most? Is that in our collaboration with faith and belief groups, very much on the ground, on the front line, have welcomed these statements, as well as governments, in helping to set out clearly those issues. It's not the only way of how we show action, but it's one way that we can come together and show that strength of dialogue. It helps us to do this multilaterally. Some, quite rightly, governments will not want to do things alone unilaterally, and that multilateral engagement is helpful to strengthen diplomacy. Obviously, there's the formal processes of impact. There's the United Nations, there's the Universal Periodic Reviews, which obviously, as we know, come up in every 4 years at the Human Rights Council. And we've sought to try and strengthen that, to encourage working with civil society's expertise alongside member states to help ensure that it's FORB-related recommendations that are in that process. So we've seen some progress. In Algeria's most recent UPR, there's never been more FORB-related recommendations, and we've seen good work done in Yemen, Eritrea, and Vietnam. We have working groups looking not least at FORB and sustainable development, where we met, first meeting was in Geneva, and we're meeting indeed tomorrow. Other areas, atrocity prevention, religious and cultural heritage, interfaith dialogue, and youth and education, as Sharon Rose talked about, that importance of that generational champions. So what is it all about? Well, I certainly recognise in terms of integral human development, the importance, the idea of human dignity. It does help to generate that broader understanding that we go way beyond as governments, not looking just at measuring economic growth, but the spiritual and broadly relational flourishing that's needed. It's important to show common ground. We did that with the UAE, with a UN Security Resolution, which for the first time recognised freedom of religion or belief alongside promoting other human rights. So we can work at times very much on common ground and work together. And so really in conclusion, we are growing as an alliance. We'd love to grow more. We'd like to welcome, if you know other member state links that could join us, we'd probably welcome very much Italy joining us soon. But also, particularly in sustainable development, we want to ensure that where there's good steps made in terms of language, that we really move to ensure the next set of SDGs are properly recognising the role and impact on religious minorities. And just finally, despite not having Fiona Bruce here, despite not having my luggage, under the banner, or more appropriately, the Foundation of Human Dignity, not least as I'm very conscious of elections in the UK and elsewhere, this is a reminder today, this conference, about the importance, the way, not least through human dignity, of building bridges, starting conversations in places where human rights can well be controversial or in danger of becoming politicised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate just when we think about your comment on the imprisoned around the world and what a serious problem that is. It's encouraging news that there are already 43 members of the Alliance. Others will be added because there's so much work, obviously, to do. I want to just flag a comment you made at the very beginning about the International Development White Paper for your government. One of the themes that has come up here, reassuringly to a degree because we want to test it, is continuity over various governments and administrations in the United States, in the UK, maybe elsewhere, of policies that one might think would be upended by subsequent administrations. It may be the case upon further reflections that that is what's happening, But what we've heard today is reassuring that on these questions, there is continuity of policy across at least some administrations. That's worth noting. Now we turn to Rocco D'Ambrosio, who's professor of political philosophy at the Pontifical Gregorian Academy here in Rome.
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation. According to my opinion, the policies are the fruit of a politics. The ancient word for politics was politeia, and Aristotle used politeia to say a project of a city, a view, a vision, we say in the commercial way to talk. And if we have got a vision of the polis, we can produce the appropriate policies. The problem is that sometimes the religious freedom is not well clarified in the vision of our society, in the politics, in the politeia. I start with an example, historical example. In 1977, Aldo Moro, a few months before to be killed by the Italian terrorist Brigate Rosse, gave a speech in the Italian parliament in which he said, we need a law about religions. It's interesting. So far, we have got no law about religions. We have got agreement between the state and the religious communities for economical support, but we have got no law. I think that the reason is that in this country, probably in other countries, you know better than me, the concept of religious freedom is influenced by the legal approach and by the political approach. I mean, when I say legal approach, I mean it's quite easy to define the religious freedom like a duty, and immediately to say that there is, to define it like a right, and immediately to say there is a duty to respect the religious freedom. But even when there is a very clear right about religious freedom and there is a duty to respect, we have got many times policies about this theme that they don't fit the problem. They are not sufficient to cover all the needs of this problem. So in this section, we are asking to ourselves if we can put this problem under the lens of the full human development. There is a way, according to what I think. The way is to change approach. I don't mean, and I don't want to be crucified by the jurist. I don't mean that we don't need the legal approach, but the legal approach is not enough to produce policies that they answers to the problem. To change approach to the problem means to adopt an anthropological approach to the religious freedom and to complete the legal vision with this anthropological approach. What does it mean, an anthropological approach? Was very well said by the Populorum Progressio in 1967, when Pope VI said, the development we speak cannot be restricted to a particular view, because the development that we talk here is something concerning all the person, physically, emotional, intellectual dimensions. And if we open our mind, we start to understand that when we create a policy for religious freedom, we can't deny these three dimensions and the communitarian dimension, because we are interested in building there is another quotation, but I don't read it for problem of time, and we are building an idea of a full development in which the religious freedom is only an aspect. Two examples. The full development of a person in the Greek thought was called by Aristotle again, autarkia. Autarkia means to be mature, to be independent, to be a realized person. So I don't talk about something like a possibility. Many times the speeches of politicians, they talk about religious freedom like a gift that I give you because I am clever, I am a good person. No, we are talking about the reality of the person and the truth of a person. In the last document of the Holy See, called Dignitas Infinita, there is an interesting passage when the document says that the dignity of a person is in trouble when is not respected the freedom, the right to profess one's religion, physical and mental integrity, the right to essential goods, to life. If we think about, is a vision of the person complete in which the religion is an aspect. And so if we are creating policies for the development of the person and the community, we need this very wide, large conception. I think that, no, another minute I've got. And I think that to obey is better to command. So I obey to the 10 minutes. And I say a word about the political environment. So often the politicians, they don't understand this anthropological approach. And they treat the religious community, yes, they say like an actor of the civil society, but in this country, I mean, probably in other countries, the problem is to create agreement for something, but not to promote a entire vision of the person. And so we should consider, for example, the reason why there are a lot of economical support to the religious community normally given according to the religion or the ideas of the politician in charge. And is not correct, of course. But on the other hand, again, the document Dignitas Infinita says, more and more people are demanding that men should exercise full their own judgment and responsible freedom in their action, and should not be subject to depression, of coercion, violence, and so on. This passage is important because to create good policies about religious freedom is important to consider on one hand the politicians, but on the other hand, we must consider the civil society and especially the civil active citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for quoting the most recent statement on dignity, dignitas infinity. I'm glad you brought that up and quoted it. It's very relevant, of course, to our conversation today. So thank you for introducing that text. And also for gesturing toward the limitations of policy when we take an anthropological approach, because dimensions of the anthropological approach cannot be reduced to simple policies. Let us prevent ourselves from being, as you put it, crucified by either the lawyers or the politicians by saying this. I don't think any of us are saying that the legal dimensions are not important or that the political dimensions are not important, but rather we have gone down a road for a long time in which we allow ourselves to believe that they're sufficient. And we recognize through this concept of human dignity, of a kind of transcendent dignity or integral human development, that if we were really going to put the human person in the center of religious freedom and of development more generally, this multidimensional approach, which reflects something of the complexity of the human person, requires different kinds of tools, different kinds of responses that are exhausted to some degree, not exhausted by policy solutions alone. So thanks very much for that contribution and intervention. We now turn to Jean-Christophe Peaucelle, who is the advisor for religious affairs, the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, the country of France.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm going to be inspired by the landscape, the view, and the quality of the audience. I'll try to speak from the point of view of a diplomat. I am a diplomat. And I'll begin as an introduction by a remark. In 40 years of career in the French diplomatic service, I could see the content of international relations changing a lot by integrating new matters, which when I began 40 years ago were marginal and which became very important on the agenda of contemporary international relations. I can quote, it's not complete, human rights, women's rights and empowerment, global health, education, development, which became sustainable development, and now integral or full human development. I can quote corporate social responsibility. I can mention also interfaith dialogue, which became an important subject when our societies discovered that they had become multicultural and multi-religious societies. And strikingly, for our conference of today, all these matters are in a way connected to the concept of full human development. Second point, which will be the core of my intervention. I think that there are several ways to define a basis on which you will build a discourse on freedom of religion or belief. If my memory is good, in 2018, the United States organized in Washington the first ministerial conference on freedom of religion. And I was there, and I remember that the opening speech was given by the then Vice President Mike Pence. And if I summarize grossly, he said freedom of religion or belief is a gift given by God. So we have to protect it and to promote it. I mean, as an individual, if I'm a believer, I can receive this argument and I can make it mine. As a religious leader, which I'm not, but there are some in the audience, you can receive it. Supposedly, if you are a religious leader, you believe in God and you believe that God created man, and you can adopt the idea that he created man as a free person with the capacity of choosing and exercising liberty. Okay. But me, as a civil servant, acting for the diplomacy of government, which is secular, which is not religious, independently of the personal convictions of myself and ministers and others, is an argument that I cannot make mine. And this fact is more important, is still more important in our modern societies, where all opinion polls, you like it or not, but all opinion polls show that a growing part of the population say that they don't belong to any religion, that they have no religious affiliation. And here we have a big question mark, which is how can you mobilize, how can you enroll your fellow citizens to protect and promote freedom of religion or belief? And we all believe that is very important. If you tell them it's a gift of God, while they don't believe in God. So we have to find another way to justify this commitment for freedom of religion or belief. And finally, the only universally accepted argument is the concept of human dignity, which can be justified from a religious point of view, but which can be also justified from a rational point of view. And it's quite interesting to see that on this subject, we have a very fascinating application of the dialogue between Fides and Ratio. And so we have this paradox that freedom of religion is not only for believers, but also for non-believers. Freedom of religion must benefit also to non-believers. That's why in international arena, like the UN or other international organizations, we are very keen to keep the wording freedom of religion or belief. The B is very important. And I remember some discussions with the American administration, previous one, and I was fighting for the B of the expression, and it was not so easy to make it understood by the interlocutors. This goes far beyond the question of freedom of religion or belief. If I don't include non-believers in the benefit of freedom of religion or belief, if I don't include them in the fight in favor of freedom of religion or belief, okay. But it means that the fight against anti-Semitism should be limited to Jews. I'm not a Jew, I'm not interested. The fight against violence against women, I'm not a woman, I'm not interested. The logic is completely crazy and desperate. So I think that this is a key point on which I wanted to insist. The key is a question of inclusiveness. There is no freedom of religion or belief without an inclusive approach. And by the way, there cannot be any human development without an inclusive approach. And this is another link. So, third point, shorter, it will be a conclusion. Now that we can maybe, hopefully, agree on this approach, everything remains to be done. Because it's very nice to be on the idea of principles, on the idea of philosophy, of great speeches in front of the United Nations General Assembly. But how shall we translate it into practical matters? I often discuss that with one of my daughters, who is a medical doctor, and she tells me she's very interested in the questions of bioethics. And she tells me I need to be trained and formed and, in the question of bioethics. But when I'm in the surgery block in front of a patient, I cannot consult my spiritual counselor. I have to act, and it's not so easy. Let's take a question like abortion. Shall we draw the concept of human dignity on the women's rights side, or on the side of protection of the child? And the debate is a difficult one in our society. So we need the reflection, and after we have to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for articulating eloquently the importance of inclusion of non-believers. I think the only thing I might have in common with former Vice President Mike Pence is that we're both citizens of the state of Indiana, and that I was not surprised when there were not major parades for him on the Champs-Élysées when he was running for president. I wouldn't have expected that. That said, let me just drop an idea here that we don't have the time to debate, but I fully agree with you. I did once think, and I think now it might have been naive, I did once think about the argument that let human dignity be a term that can be fully secular, that is within this world, or have a transcendent dimension, and that the argument might have been, well, if we allow human dignity to range across that horizon, then any government or state can define it the way it needs to and can undermine it, as states tend to do and governing figures tend to do. And therefore, the rooting of it in some kind of transcendent reality of God somehow protects human dignity from that kind of abuse. It was naive because, of course, one can have a religious definition and attribute human dignity to its source in God and still abuse the concept. So either way you look at it, the notion of dignity needs careful attention to its connotations, its meanings. Thanks for pointing that out to us. Last but not least, our final speaker in this round is Mariz Tadros, who's Professor of Politics and Development and Director of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, also working in Egypt. And I believe you're going, not that this crowd needs to wake up, but you're going to help by kind of moving around and maybe asking you individual questions, so be alert. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rocco. I think there'll be two reasons why I'll be moving around. First is to avoid your 1 minute note, and the second is there's coffee soon, so by moving around, I'll just remind you if you've taken a nap that it's almost time for coffee. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for this extremely thought-provoking day, and I'd like to especially thank Professor Fabio Petito for inviting me. Now, I come from a different positionality or different position in relation to these arguments. I started as a journalist, but also as a development practitioner 30 years ago, and no, you're not allowed to ask me how old I am. But as a development practitioner working in villages, the issue of freedom of religion or belief was very important because, as has been mentioned, there is no one particular perspective. It isn't a question of theology versus law versus foreign affairs versus development versus human rights. We need it all. And I think what we've heard this morning and through all the panels is that there is no one solution. There is no blueprint. It needs a different configuration of interventions depending on the context. Now, I will speak to the experience. I will start from very granular examples of how did we approach integrating freedom of religion or belief through development from the experience of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development. And it started in 2018, roughly, when the UK government thankfully gave us a grant, and they agreed not to interfere in how we use the money, to establish an initiative that would respond in different contexts to how do we actually work in extremely fragile, difficult contexts in promoting freedom of religion or belief. And I'm very grateful for that opportunity because we created a consortium which had human rights actors, minority rights group. It also included faith-based actors, Muslim as well as Christian, and academic institutions, and youth movements. And through that, we sought to experiment. We don't start with our theories and we test them out. We do the reverse. We go partner with local organizations that have legitimacy on the ground, and we learn by doing. What does it mean? So it's the reverse. We didn't have any theories we were testing out. We ask our local partners, we partner with them, we agree on how we're going to accompany them, and as they do the work, we do the learning from the doing, not vice versa. Now, to our very difficult situation is that we started in 2018, and of course, 2020, COVID hits. And we thank the British government that we said we want to continue, and this was allowed. And I want to now start with a very practical case. We had about 16 initiatives on the ground, one of which, or three or four of which, were to do with COVID. Now, our partners in Pakistan said we have to intervene. One of our partners, we had many, was Hive. It's a youth-led initiative that works with faith actors, but it also is youth-led from different religious backgrounds. And they noticed that in the informal settlements, in one of them it was a settlement called Joseph Colony on the outskirts of Lahore, and this was a majority Christian community, but we also worked in Hindu majority areas as well as in Shia majority areas. But in that particular community, the Pakistani government was saying, we must clean our hands. Cleaning our hands will protect from COVID, etc., etc. Except in this colony, there was no water. It's not that they didn't even have water in their homes, but also they didn't have access to clean water. The challenge was as follows. Normally, to access water, what they would do is they would go to the neighboring settlement, also extremely poor, but majority Sunni Muslim, to get their water. It isn't that there was any law, we're talking about law, against them going to that neighborhood. The challenge was, guess who was responsible for fetching the water? Who's responsible historically for fetching water? Women, exactly. So while women had to travel, they found themselves facing two challenges. The first is sexual harassment, and the second is, do you really have to make such demands on our water when we need it? It wasn't that the community was necessarily against others accessing water, but water was scarce already in that community. So what we set out was to be able to establish a COVID-19 friendly water plant. That meant, for example, that instead of having a tap, you would use your foot so that you don't pass on COVID. But you might say, that's all very good, but then development can be diluted, and it ends up just providing water, education, health for all. And where are the minorities in this? If It is that the non-Sunni Muslims, and that includes the Christians, the Hindus, the Ahmadis, who are not considered Muslim by the Pakistani constitution, and the Shias, are just there because you're providing them with water. Where is the phobe sensitivity in development in such a model? And this is where, for us, it was really important. Because as you know, you can dilute anything of its content. Anything can have a good intention. But then it can become nothing, all or nothing. So the way we set it out was, for that water plant, we said to them, we need a committee of women to run the water plant. Because as you know, what happens when a project ends? It just evaporates because no one's running it. So we said to them, establish a committee of women, not just any women, because if you get a woman from another neighborhood to run this water plant, she may become busy. She doesn't have a vested interest. It had to be the women from this particular colony living there. And you can imagine what was the first answer? Anyone? So when we asked for women to form a committee to run the water plant from the colony, what was the initial answer for people? We don't have women. Women can't run this. And so we had to, not us, not the UK, not us based in the UK, it was the local partners, the youth, including working with the faith-based actors, in order to talk about, well, if you are busy, maybe you can bring your children with you. But it had to be the poor women from that neighborhood. And I'm very pleased to say that to this day, this women's committee has moved from running the water plant to running development projects. Now, there are 3 key policy messages from this. The first is that for freedom of religion or belief to be relevant in development, it has to be relevant to people's priorities. And in this case, at that moment in time, it was water. The second thing is that local capacity is very important, because people in the global south, and everywhere actually, including Europe, are sick of people parachuting in and parachuting out. You know that model? You come in, you set up something as expert, you leave. And so for us, this idea that there is local capacity built is very important, because it means that you have established something that it's a legacy. It's not just an activity. Now, the third important point, of course, is sustainability. We're talking about sustainable development, but unless we're actually thinking beyond, that is a problem. And the fourth thing, of course, is representation. And this is where preventing development from being diluted and not serving minorities becomes very important. Because by putting women from minorities to run the show, to have the oversight over the water plant, you are ensuring that there is representation for minorities, because otherwise the initiative can become co-opted by politicians, the initiative can become co-opted by those that do not come from minority backgrounds. And it is important. Representation counts. Now, I want to move on to a second example, because I would imagine some people would say, why are we picking on Pakistan today? And I will just move a little bit to India so that it's sort of another example. Now, to produce a number of other policy messages for our work in development. Now, in India, we started our entry point not by talking about freedom of religion or belief, but by introducing participatory development methodologies. Now, those methodologies are premised on the idea that the key problem with the way we understand freedom of religion or belief is that it has been fundamentally elitist. It's people in academia or people in policy spaces that are crafting what does this mean. We need to actually not just go and ask them what is human dignity, but take it one step further. What makes life worth living for you? What are your fears? What are your hopes? Just something even more basic than that. And to do that with people who are so marginalized because they haven't had educational opportunities, because no one's actually asked them. In many cases, for poor people, it is the first time anybody actually asks them not what a concept means to them, but how they see life. We actually needed to talk about methods that enable them to maybe draw, to express themselves through drawing, through song, so other mechanisms that are familiar to them. It comes back to your point about anthropological perspectives. So for us, when we did this in India with, again, local partners, I don't think if I ever go to Pakistan or India and meet with our local partners, they would probably say, who are you? What's creed? Because those were never used. It was the local partners who were engaging. But what we learned in terms of policy there is the importance of intersectionality in practice. What did that look like in practice? It didn't mean, are we incorporating just women's voices? It meant which women, which parts, which realities. Because what we found is that just as we have the intersection of race and class and gender in the case of Christian and Muslim minorities, and I'm so grateful to you for raising intersectionality, thank you, thank you, thank you, there is the issue of caste, which makes the issue of inter and intra religious dialogues a lot more complicated. But what we discovered was the Hindus were saying that the mainstream Hindutva was not recognizing them, that the goddesses that they were worshipping were not part of the menu of the goddesses that were recognized. I saw it, thank you. So we learned that intersectionality enables us to see the broad spectrum of inequalities that exist, and not one or the other. It's those inequalities in relation to each other as they work together to create a situation which the Adivasis require an intersectional lens to understand them, because they don't talk about religion. They talk about sacred beliefs associated with forest, with flora and fauna. So again, this is where I think the question that was posed to me, what policy messages? Well, the policy message is that development, which has actually pioneered the concept of intersectionality in an applied way more than any other field, enables us to see that broad spectrum of inequalities. Now, I want to move on from the local level of policy to the international level, because, and this is my final point, because we've been running around a little bit around the issue of the SDGs, which, whether we like it or not, is the only internationally agreed reference that all countries have agreed to, independently of whether they are applying it or not. This is the one, the SDGs, which hopefully will be changed after 2030. Now, the thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is, not only doesn't it have any reference to religion except for one indicator in SDG 10 on inequality, but the general rule in international development practice is what you can't count does not count. So we have a very small space of time for a policy perspective. If we are going to bring the richness of integral development or any other development perspective to a broader audience, which we have to, because it comes back to Monsieur Jean-Christophe's point about it's not just a religious issue, it's everybody's issue, then we need to be able to make sure that those indicators are there across the board. And it does mean, I think it was Professor Attila, Father Attila, who talked about his fundamental belief in women's rights. We will know success in making that bridge internationally when people of no faith are able to defend anyone who is discriminated against. Just like Professor Father Attila was defending women's rights, without, I would think you would all agree, we have consensus, is not a woman. So I think in order to do that, we need to be able to engage with international development language, which is different from theology, and it's different from politics, and it's different from law, in a way that puts this on the agenda. And we have a very, very, very small window, because 2030 is not when they will put a new post-2030 agenda. As Professor Nazila mentioned, halfway into the SDG was last year, and people are putting the post plan now. So I think the one action point is, can we put all our efforts into trying to influence the post-SDG agenda from now, so that we would have a platform in 5 years' time that isn't, again, exclusionary of the intersections of inequality based on religion, gender, race, class, across the board, working together to marginalize people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. There's a rich menu there. I'll just make two very brief comments. One is the survey where you were asking people, what's the meaning of their lives? What do they care about? I made a brief reference today, but I'll repeat it, to Clement Sedmak's book on enacting integral human development, where he includes within the range of meanings of integral human development what he calls first and last questions. And they need not be religious as such, but these questions about meaning and purpose, where are you from, where are you headed, what is your destiny? Those kinds of questions that are not normally, we don't normally ask and engage people of, open up so many other avenues on development, including the very important point, I'm glad it was raised earlier, but you went into it more deeply, the intersectionality point. That also, I think, is mirrored a bit in the integral human development emphasis on multiple aspects of one's identity or multiple identities in one person, and in this case, in a way in which they're penalized, almost. Because these dimensions of who we are as a person can be picked apart and be part of a serial discrimination. So it's good, I think integral human development as a concept stands in judgment precisely of that kind of approach to the human person, reducing the person to a particular label, category, et cetera, and then assigning value and worth. So thanks very much for that. So I have been given 12 minutes before we need to adjourn for a much hard-earned break. Rather than take up a lot of that time at this point with interaction among each of you, maybe we'll save that for the very end. Let's open the floor to questions and comments, please, right here. And remember to please, again, identify yourself before you speak.
Thank you. Hassan Abedin, formerly with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I wanted to thank Mariz for your inspiring examples. I think those connected well with Rajeev and Rocco's points about these particular communities because, representation, as you said, matters. And on that point, I wanted to just draw your attention to a good resource point and a platform where representation is discussed. And it's based in the UK, the Religion Media Centre, the rmc.org.uk, is a platform where over 2,000 commentators from different religious traditions, 600 journalists, many of them have BBC training, come together to discuss many of these issues that have been highlighted today. But my question really is perhaps more relevant to David and to Jean-Christophe about the policy side. Both of you are engaged in this in different ways, but have to do the difficult task of working with other governments and other representations of political authority who oftentimes are wary of religious discourse. I know, Jean-Christophe, you and I have had these discussions about, how do political officials in the halls of the foreign ministry actually look at religious communities and when the concern and wariness. But we have mechanisms that we've discussed all and platforms like the UN Resolution 1618, which looks at discrimination against persons on the basis of religion or belief. But some of those are not really being mobilized. I mean, there was a long tradition of UK, US, and Australia and OIC cooperation on that, but we haven't seen that being mobilized and picked up. And sometimes we're just reinventing the wheel. And do you see that opportunities to sort of engage more forcefully at the political level to get the focus and attention on communities that Mariz and Rajeev have spoken about, that we need to get those, perhaps it's in the form of having dedicated, we have special envoys for religion and belief, but do we need to have those people involved, not just in the faith-based side, but pushing policymakers and governments to actually deliver on the promises they've already made and get those results on the ground to the communities who are affected, particularly religious minorities?
I'm going to collect a couple of questions. You absorb those, if you will. They are directed to you. Jerry?
Jerry Powers, University of Notre Dame. So far, this conversation about government's role has been a lot about what you might call public diplomacy. Raising the issue of religious freedom in international meetings, monitoring religious freedom violations and the like. But there are a lot of other policy questions that are much more controversial, and these are the kinds of questions raised by the International Religious Freedom Act in the United States, such as should governments fund religious minorities that are opposing their government's policy, another government's policies? Should we tie development aid or humanitarian aid to a country's policies regarding religious discrimination or religious persecution? Should you have economic or political sanctions imposed on a country that persecutes people because of religion? Those are the hard, controverted questions of policy that have been debated in the United States, at least, and some other countries. But what about those questions? It's not just a question of public diplomacy.
These two sets of questions are very closely connected, I think. So why don't we take them now? And Jean-Christophe and David, you were directly addressed in the first question, but I think Jerry's question engages all of us. So Jean-Christophe, you have the floor if you have anything you want to say.
By the last question,
Sure.
And I'm not going to answer because each question raised should deserve a long discussion. Should we do this or that? Should we fund this or that? How should we do? I think we should take time to consider this. What I want to stress, and it was at the end of my intervention, is that when we have described our principles, everything remains to be done on concrete matters. And maybe it could be a subject for another conference in the coming years. Regarding OIC, I'm in charge, in the French government, I am in charge of the relations with the OIC, and we had the pleasure to discuss many times, so we are talking like old veterans in a way. The question of freedom of religion or belief is one of the most difficult in the dialogue between, let's call it the West and the Muslim world. When I took my office 10 years ago, I must say that the mood was rather pessimistic in Paris about the possibility of understanding each other. Paradoxically, we had just found a compromise, because you mentioned the 1618 resolution. For those who are not fully aware, I remind that it was adopted at the same time as another resolution presented by the EU on freedom of religion or belief, and the 1618 is presented by the OIC against discriminations on the basis of religion, to be simple. Behind these resolutions, you have questions, very practical, like changing one's religion, or defamation of religions, to use OIC wording, which means the question of criminalizing blasphemy, which cannot be accepted in the frame of freedom of expression as understood in the West. So we finally found this compromise. Every year we renew these resolutions on a technical mood, which means that we just change the number of the year, but keep the text. Nevertheless, and this is a subject of concern for me, what I could observe in the last 3-4 years is a kind of regression in the mutual understanding. Not on these resolutions, because we know that it's like the text of the Ten Commandments when Moses brought them from the Sinai. You cannot touch it. But the mutual understanding has diminished on many other subjects, which means that we need still more and more dialogue. But it's not enough to dialogue. I think that we must dialogue with the idea not necessarily to approve, not necessarily to find an agreement, but at least to understand each other.
Okay, to you this way. As the number of FORB envoys grows, should they focus to become more effective envoys to their own governments? That is, advocating within governments and scrutinizing the decisions that are made around freedom of religion or belief, and bolster the regime that way. That's one way of asking the question that's been asked. What would you say about that, and about the hard policy choices that have been mentioned, how those should be approached? And then we'll turn it to others too.
Different special envoys have different mandates. I can talk on behalf of Fiona Bruce, and her mandate was outward. It was an internationally facing, but nevertheless within our Foreign Commonwealth Development Office to ensure that there was an impact across policy and development issues that were sensitive and relevant to issues of FORB. So it was holding the feet of our Foreign Office to the fire as much as working collaboratively internationally. And there'll be different variations of that with different envoys. And so certainly it is about trying to ensure that the policy of the government is relevant to FORB, but also to make sure that FORB is not just kept in its own silo. Can I just pick up on the last question first? I mean, I'm a recovering politician and been involved in, as an elected member of Parliament for some 12 years, and in recovery from that, but nevertheless, in that, just recognising that one of the things that's worked quite well in the UK, there's things that haven't worked well, but is that this issue of freedom of religion belief is a very bipartisan issue. It's the one where the cross-party group has 170 parliamentarians, and that outlives, it means that it avoids it being sectarian, avoids funding decisions being instrumentalized around religion and or other ideologies, and avoid it becoming partisan. And that's a really healthy approach to foster and for the future as well. I would say that I wish. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but sadly there's some states that are seeking to go away from the carefully built up consensus on 1618, and indeed you'll know all too well from the states that you're in contact with, and that there is a real concern that there's the irony of a rising intolerance and discrimination, the need for the collaboration of Article 1618, which isn't just obviously member state focused, it is built around civil society as well, crucial collaboration that at that very time when we need everyone to pull together and for it not, I'd say, to be instrumentalized, that is what's happening, and we must somehow try and not go beyond, and if only it was just to be able to change the date, but sadly in this year of years where there's been various attempts to seek to sectionalize what should be a broad universal concern, we must try and desperately collaborate on this issue, because it's worrying times if we don't. So with you, if only we can not seek to reinvent, but I suppose it's the behaviour of states to try and work our way through flashpoints that happen in various countries on various issues, on various texts, and how we handle that we need everyone to collaborate in the tough times as well as the good times.
Public policy priorities, because my understanding was that this event is about the global order. I felt that these questions are extremely relevant and important, but for an American policy discussion, where I work, which is a global aid architecture, global development policies, I think the issues of how do we make sure that indicators around education, health, women's rights, climate change, infrastructure, digital, and so forth, all of these things around which there is international consensus includes those that have been marginalized because of their being targeted on the basis of religion in their intersection with poverty is a priority, and it is our top priority. And the reason why I think it's our top priority is three things. Number one, this is around which there is consensus. There's very little around which there is consensus today. And thank you, David, for pointing that there is a crisis of legitimacy at the moment globally. I mean, this is not a joke. This is not, and the second reason why is that because funding that is supposed to go towards people who are socioeconomically excluded is not reaching those who are excluded on the basis of faith. And the third is because this is a priority agenda. And I just want to talk about a very concrete example of what it means for it to be a priority agenda in times of extreme hunger and extreme desperation. You may have all seen on your television screens the images, the horrific images of the floods in Pakistan a few years ago. I mean, this was a state of everybody's devastated. And some people would say, well, this is not the time to talk about freedom of religion or belief. You know, a whole population is struggling. But actually, this is exactly the time to bring about the issue of freedom of religion or belief. How? Because the worst two areas to have been affected by the floods were Balochistan and the Sindh province. And guess where the majority of the minorities are? They are in those two areas. And if we look at the Sindh province, where we have bonded labor, people who are so poor that they are intergenerationally transferring their indebtedness to newborns, they were not able to access a lot of the humanitarian aid. Why? Not because people are evil, but because there wasn't a purposeful policy to ensure that women and men, majority and minority, those on the margins and those that are on the margins, are benefiting from this humanitarian aid. And unless we have that architecture, time and time again, in catastrophes as well as day-to-day life, what we endeavor to do, around which there is international consensus, we will not be able to achieve it. And on this point, very quickly, on the everyday, in Myanmar, we see it across the board, not just in Myanmar, but across a lot of countries. Those that belong to religio-ethnic minorities are relegated to the last row of the class. Imagine if our seating arrangement in this row, in this hall here, imagine if Professor Fabio and the organizers said, right, you and you and you go back to the class. You can't sit on top here. How would it make you feel if every single day this was your experience? So no, I would actually disagree. We need to put issues of socioeconomic exclusion with FOB at the top priority, because this is what the majority of the populations around the world are struggling and suffering from.
Well, just one word, which is a clarification. I think what we've seen in the last 50 years is the formation of neo-Hinduism, which is trying to emulate, in some ways, the most extreme sort of missionary movements. And the target of these neo-Hindu groups and the Hindutva is pretty much dependent on them. The target are the Adivasis and the lower caste. They have their own religiosities. So what we are seeing today is a competition between either real or imagined so-called foreign missionaries who are out, believed to be, there to convert these guys, the Adivasis and the lower caste, and the neo-Hindus who are trying to save them from this conversion by converting them and by in some ways destroying their religiosities and getting them to take on this neo-Hindu upper caste sort of character. So it's a very peculiar situation that we've landed ourselves in the last 50 years. And I wonder, this whole, it has policy implications, because there are so many states in India which have got their laws against conversion. And in the light of all that, I wonder if, the Gandhian solution of having multiple attachments and multiple allegiances in the midst of this plurality of gods, goddesses, no God, one God, whether that's not one way out in sort of obsessed with exclusive allegiance. Yeah. Why not have multiple allegiances? I'll stop.
Professor D'Ambrosio, you have the last word, should you like to take it?
A policy about religious freedom, I give an example shortly, is a person or a group or a community set on a chair, and the first effort should be to read what the person or the community needs. And the chair has got 4 legs. The first leg is the ethical values, the ethical inspiration to produce a policy for religious community. The second leg is the practical effort and practical means that the state or other organization they offer to the religious person or religious community. The third leg is the economical support. And the fourth leg is to govern, to control the process, because are involved persons and are involved money, involved balances in the state community or in the religious community.
Now that we have 4 legs, you can leave your chairs.
Exactly.